Authorities in China's Guangzhou city have relaxed COVID-19 measures in several districts. That's as part of efforts to implement more precise virus control rules around the nation. Relaxed measures include allowing close contacts of infected people to quarantine at home. And in one district, Conghua, in-person classes in schools are set to resume, and businesses such as restaurants and cinemas could soon reopen. The eased rules come as the nation's top security chief vowed to crack down on hostile forces after protesters around China took to the streets demanding a stop to strict COVID-19 measures that have placed many under lockdowns. In Guangzhou, these videos obtained by Reuters circulating on social media, they appear to show people clashing with riot police in hazmat suits. Protesters can be seen shouting and throwing objects. Authorities are reportedly seeking out those who took part in demonstrations. Residents in Beijing told Reuters that police had come to their home and got them to complete a written record. China is dealing with fresh COVID-19 outbreaks. More than 37,000 infections were recorded over the last 24 hours. It is a slight drop from yesterday's tally, and it marks the second time that cases have fallen in more than 1 week. For more, CNA's Lo Minmin joins us live. Minmin, China's security apparatus is kicked into high gear now, evidently. What's the atmosphere like, and how are residents dealing with this increased security presence?
The atmosphere is palpably tense in places like Beijing and Shanghai with heavy police presence. Police are sighted standing by in street corners, monitoring the situation and stopping people randomly to check their phones for illegal apps like Twitter and Instagram and Telegram. These apps are banned in China but can be downloaded with VPNs to skirt China's censors to allow people to communicate safely with one another and possibly organize protests as well. And so locals tell me they are taking precautions. Some of them are deleting their messages and communications with me, deleting these incriminating apps. One man told me that he has 2 different phones, a clean one that he takes out to the streets and another one he keeps safely at home so he can maintain some ties with the world outside China. Now, there's been multiple reports of police tracking down those people involved in the protests, calling them up, demanding that they report their whereabouts, issuing them warnings or summoning them to police stations. We know that China has an immense surveillance capability with surveillance cameras installed at street corners and the ability to track what people are saying on messaging apps. And China's top security chief had said on Monday that law enforcement must crack down on what he calls hostile forces that are carrying out infiltration and sabotage activities that are criminal and illegal acts that disrupt social order. Now, this is very strong language that could signal potentially stronger crackdown on those who are thinking of returning to the streets.
Minmin, these demonstrations were at least partly due to the strict measures that have been in place across China for COVID-19. And the central government now has ordered all localities to stick to that 20-point plan to cut back excessive measures. Is that being carried out effectively, though?
Well, we are hearing more and more local governments announcing that they will be lifting lockdowns, and that includes Zhengzhou, which is the site of a Foxconn factory worker protest, as well as Guangzhou, which is the site of those violent protests that took place on Tuesday night. Now, it's worth noting that Guangzhou is one of the worst hit areas of the current COVID-19 outbreak. They are still looking at close to 7,000 cases a day, and yet local officials are announcing that they are lifting lockdowns in many districts, cancelling city-wide mass testing and allowing close contacts to quarantine at home. That is a very significant development. But meanwhile, in places like Shanghai, rules seem to be tightening. The validity of PCR tests there are now shortened from 72 hours to 48 hours. These tests are still required to go into public areas, and domestic arrivals, regardless of whether they come from low or high-risk areas, they are banned from entering most public spaces in Shanghai for 5 days. Various embassies have issued warnings of more building lockdowns. People are so worried that they are starting to stock up on food again. And one man told me that he has just bought a second freezer just in case of another long and hard lockdown. So implementation of this zero COVID policy is still very inconsistent across the board.
We've also had news today, Minmin, of the passing of former Chinese President Jiang Zemin. What was his role under Xi Jinping's administration?
Jiang Zemin doesn't have very prominent influence under Xi Jinping's administration, and that's because President Xi has been giving less and less weight to the opinions and advice of party elders. Jiang Zemin was absent from the 20th Party Congress that took place in October, and that's when we saw President Xi stack the entire central leadership team with his loyalists. And what's more, the once powerful Shanghai gang, which is the political network that's forged by Jiang Zemin that rose to prominence during his time as the leader of China, that group of people has largely been sidelined by President Xi. Remember that one of the most prominent targets of Xi Jinping's anti-corruption purge was Zhou Yongkang, who is a former Politburo Standing Committee member who is known as a close confidant of Jiang Zemin. And even though Jiang Zemin, the former leader, managed to hold on to significant power for a decade after retirement, his influence in Chinese politics now is very much diminished. I also want to point out that Jiang's death is coming at a time of intense emotions around the zero COVID policy, and that is harking back to the death of another very prominent Chinese leader, Hu Yaobang, in 1989, that eventually triggered the Tiananmen protests when people took to the streets to mourn his death and called for an end to corruption. And experts say that Chinese leaders are likely to be mindful of that, and the security apparatus will be on the lookout for potential unrest. Former Chinese President Jiang Zemin's rise to power nearly 3 decades ago was an unexpected one, even to himself. A leadership reshuffle following the Tiananmen incident in 1989 propelled him from relative obscurity to national politics, as he was seen as free of the baggage linked to the government's handling of the student protests that other senior leaders carried.
Jiang came to national prominence from being the party boss of Shanghai, and this was during the period of Tiananmen. Jiang had handled the protests with relative calm, with relatively low levels of violence, and so I think that caught the eye of Deng Xiaoping and other top leaders at that time who were looking for someone to replace Zhao Ziyang.
Mr. Jiang was elevated to the Politburo Standing Committee, China's top decision-making body, shortly after the Tiananmen incident. And 4 years later, he was made president of Communist China. Building on the foundation of strongman Deng's reform and opening up policy, Mr. Jiang oversaw modern China's breakneck rush to prosperity. And by the time he retired, it had become the fastest-growing economy in the world. He also negotiated for China's ascension into the World Trade Organization, further opening up China to the world.
China, first of all, privatized many of the inefficient state-run industries that were a legacy of the Mao era, but also looked in various ways at essentially ending many of the social and welfare privileges that had been given to the wider population during the Mao years and through the years of Deng Xiaoping as leadership.
Mr. Jiang also presided over the official handover of Hong Kong from Britain to China in 1997, and he steered China through the Asian financial crisis the following year. But the late leader is not without his critics. Rural-urban divide deepened because of the reforms he implemented. But the privatization of state-owned enterprises, some of which became hugely profitable, set the stage for Mr. Jiang's political influence, which lingered on even after he retired.
It gave Jiang a lot of networks. It gave him a lot of informal influence. So sometimes we hear this term, a Shanghai faction, being thrown about. This has to do with the influence of Jiang, or at least the network, the political networks that he created.
I think it's fair to say that they also do associate his period in power with the beginning of a lot of local corruption in China, that officials felt free to basically take bribes and act in ways that were against the law. And that's one of the legacies of Jiang Zemin that Xi Jinping in particular chose to crack down on.
Widely seen to be more liberal than his successors, Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping, Mr. Jiang is admired for his unscripted persona, a trait that's rare in other Chinese politicians. He had appeared in public singing the Elvis Presley song Love Me Tender, dancing the waltz, and was famously known for calling journalists young and naive when they asked a question he disliked. Mr. Jiang was the first leader to observe the 2-term limit put in place by his predecessor, paramount leader Deng Xiaoping. In 2003, at the age of 77, Mr. Jiang handed power to Hu Jintao, but remained commander-in-chief of the military for a further 2 years. And he continued to wield tremendous influence over Chinese politics for over a decade, even after his retirement.